Welcome back to Grammar Unit 3, which covers pronouns. In this third video, we are going to cover the final three types of pronouns: reciprocal, interrogative, and relative. Let's begin with a quick recap. Pronouns replace nouns and other pronouns, which are called their antecedents. Pronouns almost always serve noun functions in sentences. We've looked at 6 of the 9 types of pronouns. Let's examine the final 3. The last 3 types of pronouns are reciprocal, interrogative, and relative. Make sure you take the time to write your notes down on your handout. The 7th type of pronoun is called reciprocal. Reciprocal pronouns stand in for nouns in mutual relationship. Each other indicates 2 people, and one another indicates 3 or more. Let's look at an example. In the first sentence, the antecedent for the reciprocal pronoun, each other, is twins, and the pronoun indicates that the laughter was restricted to those 2 people involved. The pronoun's function is the object of the preposition at. The twins laughed at each other when they wore the same costume at the Halloween party. Notice that there's an additional pronoun in the sentence. They is a personal pronoun acting as the subject of the second clause, and its antecedent is also twins. One noun can serve as the antecedent for multiple pronouns in a sentence. Let's look at the second sentence. The lacrosse team gave one another notes of encouragement before the final game. This second sentence is a good example of why you should always find the verbs first when you begin to label sentences, because the verbs will indicate what noun functions you should look for. Here, the action verb is gave. What's the subject? Team. Now ask, what received the action of the verb? I know to look for a direct object, which in this case is notes. Notes were given. The next question is, who or what received the notes, that direct object? We have an indirect object, one another. Remember, an indirect object will always be located between an action verb and a direct object. The reciprocal pronoun, one another, indicates that the team gave the notes to its own members and that there were more than 2 people on the team. The next type of pronoun is interrogative. Interrogative pronouns stand in for nouns in the formation of a question or introduce noun clauses that imply a question or an unknown noun. These are our interrogatives: what, which, who, whoever, whom, whomever, and whose. In the first 2 example sentences, the use of the interrogative pronoun to form a question is clear. Who is singing? The pronoun is acting as the subject for the verb is singing, so we're going to use the subjective case. To whom should cat complain? In this example, the pronoun is acting as the object of the preposition to, and so we would use the objective case, whom. In the third example, after studying both roots, Jarvis still did not know which was faster. Which acts as the subject for the verb was of the dependent noun clause that implies the question or unknown of which of the 2 routes was the faster one. He didn't know, so the pronoun stands in for that unknown. Again, when identifying pronouns, be careful to make sure that they serve a noun function in the sentence. In the final sentence on this slide, the word which is modifying the noun that immediately follows it, root. So we know that it is acting as an adjective and not a pronoun. Our final type of pronoun is called relative. Relative pronouns begin dependent clauses that modify nouns or other pronouns, and they usually serve noun functions in their own clauses. The next unit on adjective clauses will go into more detail about relative pronouns, but I'm going to introduce them to you now. Let's look at a couple of examples. The fish that escaped from the seagull was a white sea bass. When we first look at sentences, we find the subject-verb combination to identify clauses. Identify the verbs first, and then look for their subjects. We have two verbs, escaped and was, but they're not joined by a conjunction, so we need to find two subjects, one for each verb. The subject for the verb escaped is the pronoun that, and the subject for the be verb was is fish. There is a dependent clause within the independent clause. Our relative pronoun that begins the dependent clause that describes the fish, its antecedent. It also acts as the subject of the action verb escaped. Let's look at another example. Mr. Chang, whom I admire, is in charge of human resources at the lab. Remember, let's look for our verbs first. In this sentence, I have two verbs, admire, an action verb, and is, a be verb. They are not separated by any conjunction, so we look for two subjects. The subject of the verb admire is I, and the subject of the be verb is Mr. Chang. The relative pronoun whom begins the dependent clause that modifies or describes Mr. Chang. Mr. Chang is acting as the antecedent of that pronoun whom. And whom is acting as the direct object of the action verb admire in its own clause. Let's practice finding all the types of pronouns. Pause the video, follow the labeling instructions for the third example sentence on your handout, and then we'll review together. Identify the verbs by type, underline all of the pronouns, and label them by type and noun function. Look back at your notes if you need reminders about the other types of pronouns or about noun functions. Did you find the verbs first and their corresponding subjects? The verbs are encouraged, inspires, and reads, and they're all action verbs. The first pronoun is who, and it's acting as the subject of the verb encouraged. Its antecedent is Alvarez sisters, which I've highlighted in red. One another is a reciprocal pronoun that is acting as the direct object of the action verb encouraged. Who or what were encouraged? One another. Its antecedent is also Alvarez sisters, and the use of one another indicates that there are more than two sisters. The next pronoun is whoever. It's interrogative because it indicates an unknown. The final pronoun is personal. Its antecedent is novel, and it acts as the direct object of the action verb reads. Although with your knowledge of pronouns, you can identify them and their noun functions, but I want to give you a little more detail about what's going on in this sentence as a short preview for our upcoming work on dependent clauses. Because you found three subject-verb combinations, you know that there are three clauses in this sentence, but only one is independent. Novel inspires. The pronouns who and whoever act as subjects of the two dependent clauses, which I want to briefly point out because they begin with pronouns that we just covered. The first dependent clause is an adjective clause that begins with the relative pronoun who and describes its noun antecedent, Alvarez sisters. The second dependent clause is a noun clause that begins with the interrogative pronoun whoever and acts as the direct object of the action verb inspires. Again, don't worry about identifying these types of dependent clauses right now. We'll cover them in detail in the next 2 units, but seeing them now will help you understand what those pronouns are doing. Great work, everyone. We've covered a lot of information in this video, so we're going to take a break for now. This is the end of part 3. The final video about pronoun types will give you some guided practice on some warm-up sentences before you tackle the pronoun exercise handout on your own. See you then.